think the really exciting parts of this study is to have had Elizabeth Ferris involved in it from sort of, I think, year 2, maybe you joined us, Beth. And Beth was one of the people who worked on the guiding principles, who wrote the guiding principles, the Interagency Standing Committee on Durable Solutions for IDPs that Luca was speaking about. And so as we plan for the 5th year of this study, what we're going to do is take all of our data and essentially hand it over to the good hands of Beth and have her really try and figure out, given her long experience, the sort of what this means in policy terms, what we can kind of figure out, what works, what doesn't, where does this go? Because those of us that are academics are not necessarily very policy oriented or related or even sort of speak that language. And so this is a really exciting partnership to work with Beth on this. As someone who was kind of started thinking about this project 20 years ago of what durable solutions for IDPs mean, and then now to have her kind of have the ability to take this 5 rounds of longitudinal data and really kind of tell us what it means. So that's our forthcoming year, and that will be part of our round 5 report that's coming out. There are hard copies that IOM kindly provided of a couple of the reports outside. You can get them all on the web, and round 4 report should be coming out, I think, by the end of October. So that's very exciting. So now let me introduce Beth, now that I've given you this lead up of what we're going to have in the next year, Beth. Dr. Ferris is a research professor at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of International Migration, and she's also a non-resident senior fellow, senior foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution. And she joined ISOM in the fall of 2015 after serving for 9 years.
Well, it's great to be here, and I must say this is a path-breaking study. I mean, I've been working on internal displacement since the early 1990s. And almost every year, researchers and practitioners alike say, we need to know what happens to people more than just one particular moment in time, which is how most of the research is done. So kudos to PRM for funding this. I want you to know that I've talked to a number of other governments saying you should follow PRM's lead and fund similar studies in other situations, because everything really depends somewhat on context. And also just to highlight what a wonderful experience it's been collaborating with IOM. You know, sometimes this interface between practitioners and academics doesn't always go real smoothly. But I think the fact that Georgetown School of Foreign Service is really focused on policy. I mean, we do research not because it's intellectually interesting and so that other academics can react to, but we really want to make the world a better place and develop research that can be used to improve practice. So what I'd like to do in just a few minutes is look at how this whole question emerged and what we know and what we don't know about internal displacement. Thinking back in 1998, as Lucas said, the guiding principles on internal displacement were presented to the UN Commission on Human Rights. They were not adopted. This is not a treaty or a convention. It's something that governments incorporate into their own national laws and policies. It's a framework. It's not like the Refugee Convention, where there is a legal status of IDPs. The definition of IDPs in the guiding principles is a descriptive one. You either are displaced or you aren't. And really, from the time the guiding principles were presented, there was concern about solutions. How do you bring about solutions? And again, it's different from a refugee situation where you've got it clearly specified, a whole cessation process in the convention. In 2001, the Emergency Relief Fund coordinator, then Jan Egeland, went to the special representative on IDPs and said, can you help us figure out when displacement ends? Because the reality was that different governments were using different standards. Different UN agencies had different markers. In 2002 in Rwanda, there were 5 different interpretations of whether or not displacement had ended. From different UN agencies, UNHCR and OCHA had different definitions, the Rwandan government. And so Jan Egeland said, can you come up with something definitive that we can use? It's an important issue because in a lot of countries, the termination of IDP programs depends on whether or not there's a sense that displacement is ended. A move from just specifically targeting IDPs to longer-term issues around reconstruction, reconciliation, etc. And the data was really needed for just the operational work. So the Brookings Institution, the Project on Internal Displacement, together with Georgetown, particularly Susan Martin, some of you may remember her from Georgetown, and Erin Mooney from Brookings, started on this process. It took 6 years of studies and meetings and consultations and talking with IDPs and different governments. How can you tell when displacement ends? So there was a pilot version that was adopted of this framework for durable solution in 2007. It was then field tested, looking at is it applicable in different situations. And the final version was adopted in 2010 by the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a bureaucratic name for the heads of all the UN agencies that are involved with humanitarian work. Right now there are 17 members or standing invitees. So from the beginning there was concern about what criteria do we use in determining when displacement ends? Well, the first idea was, well, let's look at the causes. When a conflict has ended, then displacement ends. Well, that didn't work, because there are a lot of people who remain displaced long after the conflict seemed to have been ended, and a lot of different ways for even measuring how conflicts end. Then there was the idea, well, let's look at whether they found solutions elsewhere. How many have been resettled elsewhere? How many have returned? But again, that didn't capture the reality of displacement that seemed to take place regardless of what governments and international agencies said about solutions. Some of you may remember that Liberia, for example, the Liberian government simply announced from one day to the next, well, war's over, displacement has ended, we can go on with our lives. And the reality by IDPs was quite different. And then there was a thought, well, let's look at if people still have needs related to their displacement. And that was the general framework that was eventually adopted, kind of coupled with some of these others. But importantly, and something that was hard to communicate, was this realization that ending displacement isn't something you tick off on a checkbox, that it's a process, that it takes time, that people will find solutions at different points in the journey, that the individual perceptions of displacement, as Rochelle noted, differ from person to person. Somebody can feel like they found a solution and a week later feel displaced again or actually be displaced again. So there's a clear definition. It's a rights-based approach to ending displacement, saying a durable solution is achieved when IDPs no longer have any specific assistance and protection needs that are linked to their displacement and can enjoy their human rights without discrimination on account of their displacement. So finding a durable solution doesn't mean that an IDP or a former IDP has a wonderful standard of living, has great access to university education, but rather that they're not discriminated against in comparison with those who haven't been displaced. 3 traditional durable solutions: people can go home, they can stay where they are with a degree of integration, which incidentally is a very messy concept. And what does it mean to be integrated? Or they can move someplace else. So it says that this is a process, but also spell out 8 criteria that normally have to be achieved before you can say there's been a solution to internal displacement. And these 8 criteria were really the basis of the study which we're presenting today on Iraq. First, safety and security. Over and over again, this seems to be the paramount factor determining whether or not people have found a solution. Do they feel safe wherever they are, whether it's back home or in another part of the country or in displacement? Also related to this is the idea of freedom of movement. It's not really a solution if you're limited to a camp or a particular area. You should have the ability to leave freely various places within the country. Secondly, there's a certain standard of living, an adequate standard of living, including at a minimum shelter, health care, food, water, other means of survival. And again, there's an element of subjectivity here. And do you have an adequate standard of living might mean different things to different people. Third, livelihoods and employment. It isn't enough to just have a nice standard of living if it's all coming from international humanitarian aid agencies. But are there ways that IDPs themselves can generate enough income to meet their basic needs? Housing, land, and property. I can tell you, having worked with IDPs for many years, this is often the most complicated, difficult issue in resolving displacement. Many of those who are displaced don't have formal titles for their land for one reason or another. Sometimes there are situations of customary land tenure, or sometimes the housing registries are destroyed, or there are competing claims. But there has to be some way for people to get their housing, land, and property back or receive compensation. As we'll see from the Iraq study, that continues to be a major sticking point in finding durable solutions in Iraq as well. Personal and other documentation. Running throughout the world, you see that IDPs often don't have the documents they need to access services. If you don't have an ID card in some countries, you can't access public health, even though as a citizen you may be entitled to do so. So some way of replacing personal documentation, making sure it isn't too much of a hassle for people who have been displaced. For me, one of the surprising things about the Iraq study is that this really wasn't a big issue. And in many places, such as Colombia, it's a huge issue. Family reunification. People have a right to be with their family members. Often in internal displacement, some members of the family are displaced, some aren't. Some people are missing. Again, in Iraq, this wasn't a huge factor, which is very reassuring considering the amount of time that often goes into family reunification in other places. Participation in public affairs. One of the criteria is that a solution for IDPs depends on their ability to participate in public life, community life, whether running for office or voting. And this is usually tied to documentation. If you lose your ID card, you can't vote in a particular area, often unless you go back to your community of origin, which is often impossible because of the violence. And then, finding justice or effective remedies for suffering experienced as a result of the displacement. And this includes the idea of free association, participating in community affairs, and also to have some resolution of the issues that remain as a result of displacement. So ending displacement, according to the framework on durable solutions, is a dynamic process. It makes it really frustrating for agencies and governments. I've talked to many governments who say, just give us a checklist and we'll do it. Well, human beings and displaced people don't always follow those neat little checklists. And, there's a lot of dynamism involved. A number of others have gotten involved in this issue of when displacement ends. Secretary General in 2011 had a whole decision and process for supporting durable solutions. There have been clusters dealing with resolving displacement. The Joint Internal Profiling Service came up with specific indicators for each of these 8 criteria and carries it out in a very specific way in several countries. IOM framework, as Luca mentioned, I think just its title, the Progressive Resolution of Displacement, captures that dynamism. And what I think the IOM framework brings are really a couple of things. One is an emphasis on mobility, recognizing that people may move several times, and that is good for their well-being and for ending displacement. It's more of an emphasis on IDPs as agents of their own solutions and not something that's imposed by governments or international agencies. And it also emphasizes self-reliance and coping strategies. And as we'll hear in a few minutes from the Iraq study, one of the things we found is how ingenious many IDPs are in finding ways to survive. So what does this all mean? The definition in the framework on durable solutions is well accepted. It's been incorporated into the work plans of many international agencies and governments who are facing internal displacement. is understanding that ending displacement is a process, and it takes a long time. I often look at the case of Bosnia. The 1995 Dayton Peace Accord brought a formal end to the conflict, but the latest figures we have show that close to 100,000 people are still IDPs, almost 25 years later. You're showing some of the difficulties in resolving displacement in Bosnia around housing, land, and property, but also that reconciliation and safety doesn't happen when a peace agreement is signed. The understanding that different criteria are reached at different points in time. Maybe people have an adequate standard of living, but they don't feel comfortable participating in community life for several more years. This is, how to bring in participation in IDP agency. Those aren't really emphasized in the framework on durable solutions, but there may be ways of bringing that into our understanding. Funny, this is a pretty high standard in the framework for durable solutions. No longer have any specific assistance and protection needs linked to displacement. I did a lot of work with people displaced by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in the U.S. And there haven't been any longitudinal studies. That's another thing we should have people displaced by Katrina. But anecdotal evidence suggests that people who were displaced 15 years ago still feel discrimination or feel like they're not able to access the full range of rights, even in a country like the United States. Is this too high a standard to expect for complicated displacement situations elsewhere? I've been toying with the idea that when you look at local integration for refugees and for IDPs, maybe we need another category of getting by. People who are doing okay, their kids are in school, they're making enough money, they have access to basic services, they're not totally integrated. They still harbor a dream maybe of going home, but they no longer need international assistance. Maybe there's something we should work with around this, getting by or self-reliance. Some of the work being done on refugees in Kenya, for example, right now, shows that an emphasis on self-reliance.
Sorry, that's not.
Hello? Something.
It's Ferris in Iraq.
Okay. So we might want to think about how people can be supported to have a good standard of living and continue to hold the dream of going back home or full local integration. But maybe we need to think about solutions for IDPs that aren't quite so demanding. And again, it incorporates their own perspectives and looking at resolution of displacement needs. So this is an exciting study and looking forward to not only understanding what it means for Iraq, but what it means for IDPs.